All right. So this week we're going to be talking about the revolution within and other groups that we normally don't hear about when we talk about the revolution. You know, what happened to women, what happened to African Americans, what happened to Native Americans, what happened to loyalists. These are things that we're going to address today. Now, it is week 6, which means you have an exam due on Friday at 11:59 p.m., and this material is included on that exam. So please be using your time wisely this week to make sure that you can get everything finished and turned in on time and do well. All right, so first I'm going to read an excerpt from a piece that probably is unfamiliar to you, and I'll be interested to see, if it sparks anything in you, if you think of anybody that you think may have written this. Their valor's great, and justice holds the scale. They fight for freedom, while we stab the breast of every man who is her friend professed. They fight in virtue's ever-sacred cause, while we tread on divine and human laws. Glory and victory and lasting fame will crown their arms and bless each hero's name. So think of political authors during this period. Anybody that you might think of, I'm sure Thomas Jefferson comes to mind. Benjamin Franklin probably comes to mind. Thomas Paine might come to mind. But the point is that you probably don't know who wrote this, and that women's roles, just like the roles of Native Americans and African Americans, were important components of the political and social environment of the American Revolution. So this piece that I just read to you is by Mercy Otis Warren, and it's an excerpt from The Group, which was a play published in April 3rd, 1775. And there she is. This excerpt is spoken by a loyalist character, bemoaning the virtuous patriots and the likelihood of their victory over the empire. Mercy Otis Warren wrote political satires that served as anti-British propaganda. Plays such as The Group criticized the corruption of Massachusetts royal government and encouraged citizens to resist British tyranny. The Group was Warren's most popular pre-revolutionary work and served as a call to arms for colonists. It was published anonymously. Now, why might that be? Why might that be published anonymously? Think about that for a second. I'm sure your first instinct is she's a woman, right? Sure, makes sense. But also, were women just walking around writing stuff like this? Is that within their normal role right now? No. So not only could she have brought, dishonor to herself and her family, but being that outspoken is just not something that women were doing during this period. So she published anonymously to avoid the risk of being chastised as an outspoken woman, and out of a concern that the work would not be taken seriously had the public known the author was female. Her career reflects the limits and potential of women's role in the Revolution. The American Revolution was a struggle for national independence that unleashed public debates and political and social struggles that challenged established structures of power within America. By 1775, talk of liberty pervaded the colonies. In fact, Warren's publication of The Group came only 16 days before the first shots of the Revolution at Lexington and Concord. The right to resist oppressive authority, so deeply ingrained by the imperial struggles of conflicts such as the French and Indian War, were now invoked against Britain itself by colonists of all backgrounds. With liberty and equality as their rallying cries, previously marginalized groups advanced their demands. Long accepted relations of dependency and restrictions on freedom suddenly appeared illegitimate, a process not intended by most of the leading patriots, who were elite white colonial patriarchs. The revolutionary generation included numerous women who contributed to the struggle for independence. In the mid-18th century, more women were receiving a formal education. By the American Revolution, more than one-half of all white women in New England and at least one-third of all white Southern women were literate. Increasing female literacy and access to newspapers, pamphlets, and magazines allowed the opportunity for women to form their own political opinions. Women who were previously active and highly politicized, or politically active and highly politicized, were known as female politicians. Female politicians viewed themselves as independent political beings. So what types of women were female politicians? Think about it for a second. They're going to be literate, obviously. And what do they look like? They probably look like Mercy Otis Warren, which means they're probably white, probably middle class or elite, right? They needed access to education. I cannot talk today, I'm sorry. They needed access to education, literacy, political space and discussions, often, through their husbands, in order to be able to be politically active, right? So only some women have this opportunity. Mercy Otis Warren took advantage of the Revolution's expanding print culture, consumed by her fellow female politicians, to publish her satirical plays and political poems. Despite an official anonymity, Warren's work was well known and celebrated in a close-knit world of patriot leaders. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton all spoke highly of her work. The work of Warren and women like her proclaimed that as women, these authors had something significant to say to a larger public. Female politicians were not the only women who experienced great change or expanded their roles during the Revolution. This is Deborah Sampson. I don't know if any of you know who she is, but you will in just a second. Deborah Sampson, the daughter of a poor Massachusetts farmer, disguised herself as a man and in 1782 enlisted in the Continental Army. She was 21. Sampson participated in several battles and even pulled a bullet from her own leg so the army doctor wouldn't discover her identity. However, her commanding officer discovered her secret, but kept it to himself, and she received an honorable discharge at the end of the war. Other patriotic women took part in food riots against merchants accused of seeking profits during the war by holding goods until their prices rose. And the funny thing about this was, when you think of a food riot, you think of a bunch of people just sort of stealing things, and that's not what they did. They're still acting within the realm of proper gender behavior, right? These are ladies, so you can't just steal stuff if you're a lady. What they did instead was they would take the food that they wanted and leave the price that they thought was fair. So they would leave the money for what they thought was the proper price as opposed to what merchants were charging. Wives of both soldiers and political leaders faced major changes brought on by their husband's absence. When a man left for battle or for the Continental Congress, his wife oversaw the day-to-day management of the family farmer business, including land and financial transactions, or managing laborers, servants, and slaves. Wives also became their husband's political advisors and confidants. The wife of a patriot in politics represented him among his fellow colonists back home. Many of these women also found time to contribute homespun goods to the war effort. The new ideology of Republican motherhood also allowed women to enjoy an improved status thanks to the political and social climate of the American Revolution. According to Republican motherhood, women played an indispensable role by training future citizens. So think for a minute about what you would need in order to provide children with the proper responsibilities and understandings of citizenship. In other words, how would the implementation of Republican motherhood create opportunities for wives and mothers? Think about it for a second. If you're training future citizens, then you probably need to have the tools with which you would train them, right? So, while it ruled out direct female involvement in politics, it did encourage the expansion of educational opportunities for women so that they could impart political wisdom to their children. Gender, nonetheless, formed a boundary limiting those entitled to the full blessings of American freedom. For men, political freedom meant the right to self-government, the power to consent to the political arrangements that ruled them. A woman's relationship to the larger society was mediated through her relationship with her husband. In both law and reality, women lacked the essential qualification of political participation, the opportunity for autonomy based on ownership of property and the ownership of self. Since the common law included women as dependents of their husbands, women could not be said to have property in themselves in the same sense as men. Remember, we've talked about coverture and how when a woman gets married, her identity is literally covered by her husband. So they don't have this autonomy or ownership of self that men do. During and after the long struggle against British rule, white women in some ways enjoyed a higher status. This change was often a temporary result of the upheaval of societal norms that came with the Revolution. For others, including Native Americans, Loyalists, and African Americans, free and enslaved, who we will discuss in just a moment, American independence meant a deprivation of freedom. The ideals of the American Revolution inspired struggles for social equality and national independence in France, Haiti, Latin America, and other nations. But within the new republic, the debate over who should enjoy the blessings of liberty would continue long after independence had been achieved. Phillis Wheatley was an African American poet who was brought to America as a slave in 1761. Wheatley learned to read and published her first poem in a New England newspaper in 1765 at the age of 12. The fact that a volume of her poems had to be printed with a testimonial from prominent citizens including John Hancock, affirming that she was the author, illustrates that many whites found it difficult to accept the idea of black intellectual ability. Yet by invoking the Revolution's ideology of liberty to demand their own rights, and by defining freedom as a universal entitlement, blacks like Wheatley demonstrated how American they had become, even as they sought to redefine what American freedom represented. In the 1770s and 80s, states began passing state constitutions. The least democratization occurred in the southern states. In Virginia and South Carolina, the new constitutions retained property qualifications for voting and authorized the gentry-dominated legislature to choose the governor. Maryland combined a low property qualification for voting with high requirements for office holding. This kept the non-elite out of positions of political power. The most democratic new constitutions moved toward the idea of voting as a right instead of a privilege, but they generally stopped short of universal suffrage, even for free men. Virginia's Constitution of 1777 was the only one to sever voting completely from financial considerations, eliminating not only property qualifications, but the requirement that voters pay taxes. Now, this caption does read, in the 18th century, voting entailed verbally calling out your vote, which means that you would go, like this man here, you would go up to the courthouse and they would ask you, who are you voting for? And you would yell who you're voting for, which it has its own inherent set of problems, right? If you're, not that elite and you go to vote and the person you work for or, someone that runs the church that you're in hears you vote the way that they don't want you to, it could mean repercussions for you. So we are very fortunate that people have worked very hard for us to be able to vote privately. So overall, the revolution led to a great expansion of the right to vote. By the 1780s, with the exceptions of Virginia, Maryland, and New York, a large majority of the adult white male population could meet voter requirements. The New Jersey Constitution of 1776 granted suffrage to all inhabitants who met a property qualification, which included women until the words male and white were added in 1807. All of these changes, whether permanent or not, marked a great change from pre-revolution statutes on voting. As remarkable as the expansion of political freedom was, the revolution's impact on American religion was also. Religious toleration, declared one Virginia patriot, was part of the common cause of freedom. We've already seen that some colonies like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania had long made a practice of toleration, but freedom of worship before the Revolution arose more from the reality of religious pluralism than from a well-developed theory of religious liberty. The War for Independence weakened a deep tradition of American anti-Catholicism. In 1778, the U.S. formed an alliance with France, a Catholic nation. The indispensable assistance France provided to American victory strengthened the idea that Catholics had a role to play in the newly independent nation. This varied greatly from the previous notion that full rights only applied to Protestants. And I will continue talking about religion and move on to other subjects in part 2.